The surveyor stopped talking. She had been chattering the whole morning, friendly, easy, the way young people talk when they don't know the ground they're standing on. But now she went quiet. She looked down at the steel chain stretched flat across the frozen grass, then down at the yellowed chart pinned under her thumb, then back at the chain. She did the measurement again. Slower. The old man standing beside her said nothing. He had been saying nothing for a very long time. "Sir," she finally said, and her voice had lost all its ease. This fence is 31 feet inside your line." 31 feet, not 31 inches. Not a few feet a careless man might argue over a beer. 31 feet of good Kentucky bottomland, tobacco ground, a spring, a fence that everyone in the hollow swore had stood right there since before the Kennedy years, was sitting on the wrong side of the truth. The old man did not look surprised. He did not look angry. He reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth, and he held it the way another man might hold a Bible. By the time it was over, one of these two men would lose everything he had built, and it would not be the one the whole town had spent 22 years betting on. Now, before we go back, do me one small thing. Tell me down in the comments where you're watching this from. What state? What county? Because this is a story about land, and I like to know how far these old land stories still travel. And while you're down there, make a bet. Look at these two men, the thief who won't stop taking, and the quiet old man who won't say a single word to stop him, and tell me which one you think loses everything before this is over. Say it now. Write it down. And remember what you guessed, because most of you are about to be wrong. To understand how 31 feet could cost a man 22 years of silence, 22 years of being called a coward by his own neighbors, we have to go back past the highway that was about to come, back to a cold spring morning in 1962. His name was Silas Renfro, and he was a man who measured twice. He measured his seed. He measured his rows. He measured his coffee into the pot with a scoop worn smooth by 30 years of the same hand. People in the hollow thought it was a nervous habit. It wasn't. It was the only thing his father ever really taught him, standing out in the east field when Silas was 9 years old, and it went like this. Anything worth keeping is worth measuring, because the world will take from a man who doesn't know exactly what he has. Silas had 80 acres. He knew that the way he knew his own name. The land had come down from his father, and from his father's father before that, and Silas farmed it the way they had, tobacco on the good bottom ground, a little corn, a few head of cattle up on the hill where the soil ran thin. It was not a rich farm, but it was clean, and it was square, and it was his, and there was a particular satisfaction in standing on your own porch at dusk and knowing that every foot you could see in any direction belonged to you and no one else. His wife had understood that. Ada had understood it better than he did, maybe. She was the one who had planted the black walnut down by the spring the first spring they were married, a little whip of a thing no thicker than her wrist, and she used to say she was planting it for the grandchildren they didn't have yet. Ada had been in the ground herself for 4 years now. The walnut had grown tall and broad, and it shaded the spring and the summer, and Silas could not walk past it without hearing her voice. So when I tell you what this land meant to Silas Renfro, understand this. It was not dirt. It was his father's hands and his wife's memory, and the only argument he had ever won with time. Take an acre from a man like that, and you are not taking an acre. You are taking his father back out of the ground. There was one thing Silas owned that he valued more than the tractor, more than the barn, more than nearly anything in the house. It was a survey, an original plat map drawn up in 1911 by a county surveyor named Hollis, on heavy paper gone the color of weak tea, showing every corner and every bearing of the Renfro place in a careful hand. His father had shown it to him the same day he taught him to measure. But the paper was not the important part, and his father had made sure he understood that too. The important part was in the ground. They had walked the corners together, the boy and the old man, and at each one his father had knelt down and brushed away the grass and shown him an iron pin, a rod driven deep by Hollis's crew in 1911, its top barely showing, cold and solid under the frost. "Now you listen to me," his father had said, and Silas remembered the exact weight of the words 50 years later. "A fence can lie, a neighbor can lie, your own eyes will lie to you if you let 'em. But this pin here," and he'd tapped it with one thick finger, "this pin doesn't want anything. It's been telling the truth in the same spot since before you were born, and it'll be telling it long after you're gone. You lose everything else, you keep track of your pins." Silas never forgot it. A fence can lie. A pin under the frost tells the truth for 100 years. He would come to need that lesson more than his father could ever have known. That cold spring morning in 1962, Silas was mending harness on the porch when he heard the low grind of a truck coming up the hollow road. It was a moving truck, loaded high, and it turned in, not at his place, but next door, at the old Pruitt farm that had sat empty since winter. A man climbed down from the cab. Big fellow, quick-moving, already talking to the driver, already pointing at things, already laughing at something. Even from across the road, you could see he was the sort of man who filled up a space when he walked into it. Silas watched him for a while over the top of his coffee. Then he went back to his harness. He didn't know it yet. He had no way to know it. But the man unloading that truck across the road was going to spend the next 22 years trying to take Silas Renfro's land away from him. A foot here, a foot there, an inch at a time. So slow and so quiet that a man could almost convince himself it wasn't happening at all. And in all those 22 years, he would never once look Silas Renfro in the eye while he did it. His name was Odell Trask, and within a week the whole hollow knew it. That was the kind of man he was. Silas had lived on that road his entire life, and half his neighbors still weren't sure what year he'd been born. Odell Trask had been there 7 days, and he'd already shaken every hand at the feed store, bought around at the filling station, told 3 jokes that got repeated, and let it be known, casually, always casually, that he intended to make the old Pruitt place into the finest spread in the county. You wait and see. He came across the road to introduce himself on the 2nd day. Big hand out, big smile, a laugh that started before anything funny had been said. "Odell Trask," he said. "Reckon we're neighbors now. Heard you've had this ground a long while." "My whole life," Silas said. "Well?" Odell looked past him, out over the bottom ground where the tobacco would go, and something moved behind his eyes that Silas didn't have a name for yet. "Good land. Real good land. Man's lucky to have it." Silas shook the hand and said the polite things a man says. But he noticed, the way he noticed most things and mentioned few of them, that in the whole conversation Odell Trask had looked at the land a good deal more than he'd looked at Silas. He thought about it that evening on the porch. Then he let it go. A man was allowed to admire good ground. There was no law against it. There was no law against a great many things Odell Trask was going to do. Here is a thing you learn, farming next to another man for a while. You learn that a grieving man looks like a soft man. Silas was 2 years widowed when Odell came. He kept to himself. He didn't go to the church suppers anymore, didn't linger at the store, didn't raise his voice or press his opinions. To a man like Odell, a man who read people the way a card sharp reads a table, that quiet looked like weakness. It looked like an old man running down, alone on 80 acres, with no wife and no children near, and no fight left in him. Odell was wrong about that, but it would take him 22 years to find out how wrong, and by then it would be far, far too late. The first move came the following spring. There was an old fence that ran along the line between the 2 farms, cedar posts and woven wire, put up in Silas's grandfather's time. A stretch of it down near the road had gone soft with rot, and one morning Silas came out to find Odell's men already at work on it, pulling the old posts and setting bright new ones. Odell was there, sleeves rolled, sweating and friendly. "Hope you don't mind, neighbor," he called out. "Them old posts were plumb shot, rotted clean through. Figured I'd do us both a favor and put in good ones, my treat. Line's all right by you, ain't it? Silas walked down and looked at the new fence. It ran straight and tight and handsome. And it ran, by his eye, about a foot onto his side of where the old one had stood. Not much. A man glancing at it would never have known. A man in a hurry, or a man who didn't want trouble, would have nodded and thanked his neighbor for the free posts and gone back to his breakfast. Line's all right by you? Odell said again, still smiling, and there was just the smallest thing under the smile, a watching, a waiting, that told Silas everything. He understood, standing there in the wet grass, exactly what was happening. And he made a decision that his neighbors would spend the next 2 decades calling cowardice. "Fence looks fine," Silas said. "Appreciate the posts." He turned around and walked back to the house. He did not sleep much that night. He lay in the dark and he thought about his father kneeling in the east field with his thick finger on a cold iron pin. A fence can lie. And he thought about Ada, and the walnut tree, and the 80 acres that were the only argument he had ever won with time. Sometime after midnight he got up, put on his coat and boots, took a lantern and a 100-foot tape, and walked out to the corner where he knew the 1911 pin was buried. He knelt down in the frost, the way his father had, and brushed the dead grass away until the iron showed. Cold, solid, telling the truth in the same spot it had told it for 50 years. Then he ran his tape from the pin to the shining new fence post. The old line, the true line, the line Hollis had walked and marked in 1911, should have put the fence at a certain distance from that pin. Silas knew the number by heart. He'd known it since he was a boy. The new post stood 12 inches inside it. 12 inches, 1 foot. Silas knelt there in the dark with the tape in his hand and the lantern throwing his shadow long across the grass, and he felt something go very cold and very quiet and very certain in his chest. He did not feel like shouting. He did not feel like driving over there and putting his fist through Odell Trask's smiling face, though a younger man might have. He felt instead the way he felt when he measured his seed, exact, patient, sure. He walked back to the house. He took down an empty ledger book from the shelf, a plain thing, black cloth cover, the kind you could buy at the drugstore for $1. He sat at the kitchen table with the lantern, opened it to the first page, and in his careful, deliberate hand he wrote, April 3rd, 1962. Trask replaced south line fence. New post set 12 inches inside true line, measured from Hollis pin, southeast corner. Ground froze, then thawed. Sky clear. Witnessed. He stopped. Then the next morning he walked up the hill to where his hired man was forking hay, and he brought Emmett Boone back down to the corner, and he showed him the pin and the tape and the 12 inches, and he had Emmett measure it himself. "You want me to say something to him?" Emmett asked. Emmett was younger and hotter, and he did not understand. "No," Silas said. "I want you to remember you saw it. Put your initials in my book." Emmett looked at him a long moment. Then he took the pencil and signed. That was the beginning. Silas Renfro had a rule, and he lived by it the way he lived by everything, quietly and without needing anybody to agree. I don't argue with a man who's already made up his mind to lie. I let the ground remember for me. Across the road, Odell Trask sat on his own porch that evening, well pleased with himself. He had taken a foot of the best bottomland in the hollow, and the old man next door had thanked him for the fence posts. Silence, to Odell, meant surrender. It meant the grieving old fool was exactly as soft as he'd looked. It was the single worst mistake Odell Trask would ever make, because everything he did in the dark, quiet and careful and sure no one was keeping count, every post, every inch, every lie told with a smile over a rotted fence, was being written down. And one day, all of it was going to be read out loud. The second post came the next spring. Odell had a story ready for it, of course. Frost heave, he said. You know how the ground shoves in the winter, Silas. Through that whole corner cockeyed. Had to reset it. And he had. He'd reset it another 8 inches onto the Renfro side, and the story was even half true, because frost does move a post, and that was the beauty of it. Every lie Odell told had a little truth holding it up. Silas said, "Frost'll do that," and that night he took his lantern and his tape down to the pin, and Emmett held the other end, and the ledger got another line. The third post was a runaway truck. The fourth was cattle leaning on the wire. The fifth, Odell didn't bother to explain at all. By then he'd learned Silas wasn't going to ask. Understand how patient this was. He never took much. A few inches in a wet spring. A foot the year the creek flooded and everybody's fences were a mess anyway. Some years he took nothing at all, and Silas would walk the line and find the fence exactly where he'd left it and feel almost foolish for watching. Then the next spring a post would have wandered again, always toward the Renfro side, always with a reason, always in the dark or in the mud, or in the middle of some general chaos where one moved post could hide. By the third year, the fence had crept 3 feet. By the seventh, 9. 9 feet over a quarter-mile of line is a strip of ground you can plow. Odell was running his tobacco rows right up to the wire now, and every one of those rows sat on dirt that Hollis's map said belonged to Silas Renfro. And the ledger on the kitchen shelf had filled 30 pages. Every inch, every date, every weather, every reason Odell gave, every mark from Emmett Boone's steady hand beside it. Now, here is where a lesser man's patience would have started to look like something else. Because the hollow had begun to talk. It's a small thing, a fence line. People notice it the way they notice everything in a place where nothing much happens. They noticed that Odell Trask's tobacco kept creeping west, and that Silas Renfro's kept giving ground, and they drew the conclusion that came easiest. Not that one man was stealing, that the other man was weak. "Renfro won't say boo to him," they said at the feed store. "Trask has run that fence clean across the bottom and the old man just lets him. Grief'll do that to a fellow, I reckon. Took the fight right out of him." Some of them said it kinder than that. Some of them said it worse. But the shape of it was always the same. Silas Renfro had gone soft, gone timid, gone coward, and Odell Trask was taking him for a fool, right out in the open where God and everybody could watch it happen. Even Emmett Boone started to wonder. He was a loyal man, and he held the tape every time without complaint. But one night down at the pin, he finally said what he'd been carrying. "Mr. Renfro, you got it all wrote down. Every inch of it, years of it. Why don't you take it to a lawyer? Why don't you make him stop?" Silas rolled the tape back up slow before he answered. "Because the day I make him stop," he said, "is the day he learns to be careful. Right now that man thinks he's winning. Thinks I'm too soft or too dumb or too sad to notice. So he's getting greedy, and he's getting sloppy, and he's not hiding a thing from me because he doesn't believe he has to." He looked up the dark line of the fence toward Odell's place. "You don't spook a thief while he's still filling his pockets, Emmett. You let him fill them all the way up. That's when a man gets careless enough to hang himself." Emmett didn't fully understand it, but he made his mark in the ledger, same as always, and he kept his mouth shut at the feed store while other men called his boss a coward. It was in the 15th year that Silas learned Odell had stopped trusting the fence alone. The county clerk mentioned it, offhand, not knowing it meant a thing. Odell Trask had come in and filed a corrected deed description on the Pruitt place. Paid the fee, had it recorded, all proper. A surveyor's amendment, he'd called it, fixing an old error in the metes and bounds. Silas drove to the courthouse the next morning and paid a nickel to read it. And there it was, in the county's own book, stamped and recorded and official. A boundary description that moved the Renfro-Pruitt line 30 feet west of where Hollis had drawn it in 1911. On paper, real paper, government paper, the kind of paper that decides who owns what when men are dead and memories are gone, Odell Trask now owned the strip he'd been stealing an inch at a time. He'd made the theft legal. Or he'd made it look legal, which in this world is most of the way to the same thing. A weaker man would have panicked. A weaker man would have finally run to that lawyer, waving his little ledger, and started the fight Odell had been trying to provoke for 15 years. Silas did not. He went home. He got down the ledger, and he wrote a new entry, careful and square, with the date and the clerk as his witness this time. O. Trask filed corrected deed at county, this date, moving line 30 feet west of Hollis, 1911 survey. Filing contradicts corner pins in place since 1911. Then he sat back and, for the first time in 15 years, he almost smiled. Because Odell had just made his second mistake, and it was worse than the first. The moving fence, a man could always claim was frost and cattle and honest accident. But you cannot file a paper by accident. You cannot record a lie at the county courthouse and later say the wind did it. Odell had taken the theft out of the mud in the dark and put it down in ink, in the public record, in his own hand, the one place a lie can never later pretend it wasn't told on purpose. He'd built himself a fence he thought no one could climb. He didn't know he'd just signed a confession. And down at the feed store, they were still calling Silas Renfro a coward. They'd go on calling him that for 7 more years, right up until the morning it stopped being funny for every single one of them. Because the fence was still moving. And Odell Trask hadn't yet taken the one thing that would finally test whether an old man's patience had a bottom to it after all. He was about to reach for the walnut tree. It happened in the 18th year, and it happened the way everything Odell did happened, quietly, with a reason ready, in a season when a moved fence could hide. The spring flooded that year. The creek came up over the bottom and left half the hollow's fences leaning in the mud, and when the water went down, Odell was out there for a week straight, resetting posts. Honest work. Necessary work. Every farmer along the creek was doing the same. But when Silas walked his line after the water dropped, he found that Odell's new fence had jumped the spring entirely. For 18 years, the theft had been dirt, tobacco ground, plow ground, ground you could measure and grieve and write down. Silas had borne all of it. But this time the fence didn't stop at the spring. It swung wide around it, out past the low ground, and it took in the black walnut tree. Ada's tree. The one she'd planted the first spring they were married, no thicker than her wrist, for grandchildren they never got to have. It stood on Odell Trask's side of the wire now. A man Silas had never invited onto his land could walk out any evening and stand in the shade his dead wife had planted, and there was a fence between Silas and the last living thing her hands had put in the ground. Of everything Odell took in 22 years, that was the one he would come to regret the most. He just didn't know it yet. Neither did Silas. Silas only knew that he walked back up to the house that evening and sat at the kitchen table with the ledger open in front of him, and could not, for a long while, make his hand write anything down. Then he did. Date, weather, fence reset after flood. Now encloses lower spring and Ada's walnut on Trask's side. Emmett's mark beside it, the same as always. But it was not the same as always. Something had changed in the old man that night, and it was not resolve. It was something closer to breaking. Odell, meanwhile, was flying high. 18 years of good stolen bottom had made the Trask place the biggest working spread in the hollow, on paper anyhow, and in the eyes of every man who drove past those long green tobacco rows running clear to the creek. Odell had a new truck. He had that second tractor he'd bragged about the first day. He carried himself through the feed store like a man who'd earned every inch of it, and in a way he believed he had. He'd been patient. He'd been smart. He'd taken what a softer man had been too weak to keep. That's how Odell told the story to himself. That fall he threw a party. He called it a harvest supper, but it was a coronation. Half the hollow came. You didn't say no to the biggest man in the valley, and they ate his barbecue and drank his beer in the light of his barn, and along about dark Odell climbed up on a hay wagon with a glass in his hand to make a toast. "To the biggest spread in this hollow," he called out, and they cheered him. Then he grinned, and he found Silas's farm in the dark with a wave of his glass, and he said the thing that the whole hollow would remember later with their faces burning. And to good neighbors, the quiet kind, the kind that don't give a man no trouble about a fence. And he laughed, and they laughed with him, because it was easy to laugh at the coward across the road who wouldn't say boo to a thief. Silas was not there. He was never invited. He was sitting on his own dark porch a quarter-mile off, and the sound of that laughter carried across the bottom on the still fall air, and he heard every note of it. Remember that laughter. The whole hollow would need to remember it, because the day was coming when every man who laughed on that hay wagon would have to stand at the county courthouse and read, in black and white, exactly what kind of neighbor Odell Trask had really been. But that day was still 4 years off. On that fall night, the coward across the road just sat in the dark and took it, the way he'd taken everything else. The fire came that same winter. Silas woke a little after 2 to an orange light in his window that had no business being there. And by the time he got his boots on, the back of the house was already going, the old summer kitchen, the wall by the wood stove, flames climbing the dry clapboard fast. There was no fire company that would reach the hollow in time. There was just an old man and a bucket and a well, and everyone who has ever fought a house fire alone knows that the bucket is a joke, that the house is already gone, that all a man can do is decide what he runs in to save. Silas ran in for the ledger. He would tell Emmett later that he didn't even think about it, and that was the truth. He went through the smoke to the kitchen shelf, and he got the hard-bound book with 18 years of stolen inches written in it, and he came back out coughing with his eyebrows singed and the book held against his chest, and he stood in the yard and watched a third of his house burn down around the thing he'd saved. Nobody ever proved how the fire started. The stove, people said. Old wiring, people said. A man like Silas, alone, careless in the cold. Maybe that's all it was. But Silas stood in that smoking yard before dawn with the ledger in his hands, and he looked across the dark bottom toward the Trask place, and he thought about how a fire is one more thing that can hide in the general chaos of a bad winter. He never wrote an accusation in the book. He had no proof, and a man who lives by the record does not put down what he cannot measure. He only wrote, "House fire, this date, cause unknown, ledger recovered." And he let the words "cause unknown" sit there and mean whatever the truth was. That was the winter Silas nearly quit. There is a limit to what patience costs a man, and Silas Renfro had spent 18 years paying it. The land, the whispers, the coward's name, the laughter on the hay wagon, and now a burned house and a wife's tree standing behind another man's fence. One night, deep in that cold, he sat at the table with the singed ledger in front of him and a fire going in the good stove, and he thought, clear as anything, about feeding the book into it. What was it, after all? A book of numbers. 18 years of an old fool measuring his own defeat by lantern light while the whole hollow laughed. Odell had the land. Odell had the paper at the courthouse. Odell had the tree. What did Silas have but ink? He carried the ledger to the stove. He opened the iron door. The heat came up at his face, and then he stopped, because he thought of the pin. He set the book down, and he took his lantern, and he walked out into the killing cold, down through the snow to the lower corner of the bottom, and he knelt and dug the frozen grass away from the top of Hollis's iron pin. His father's pin, still there, still solid, still telling the exact same truth it had told since 1911, unmoved by fire or flood or laughter or 18 years of a greedy man's lies. A fence can lie. A pin under the frost tells the truth for 100 years. Silas knelt in the snow with his hand on the cold iron for a long time. The fence moved, he said finally, to the pin, to his father, to Ada. The pin didn't. And someday somebody's going to come out here with a chain and a map, and they're going to have to decide which one the law believes. He walked back up. He put the ledger back on the shelf. He did not burn it. 22 years. That was how long Silas Renfro kept quiet, kept measuring, kept writing it down while the world called him a fool. And in the 22nd year, the state of Kentucky decided to build a highway. The highway did not care about Odell Trask, and it did not care about Silas Renfro, and that was the whole point. The state of Kentucky had decided to run a bypass through the county, and the surveyed route came down the hollow and clipped the eastern edge of the bottom. Renfro land, Trask land, the disputed line and all. And the law that governs a thing like that is cold and simple. Before the state can buy a foot of a man's ground, the state has to know exactly whose foot it is. So the order came down from the county that every parcel along the corridor would be resurveyed. Not by a man either neighbor hired, not by a fence or a memory or a handshake, by a licensed surveyor working from the original recorded monuments, whether anybody liked what she found or not. For 22 years, the fence had been the only judge of that line, and the fence answered to Odell Trask. Now something was coming that didn't answer to anybody, and it was coming fast. The notice tacked up at the courthouse said the road crews would break ground in 30 days. Whatever the resurvey established in those 30 days would be filed with the state, stamped, and made permanent. The legal boundary of record for both farms, from that day forward, forever. 22 years of patient theft and 22 years of patient waiting were both about to come down to 1 month, 1 chain, and 1 woman's reading of the ground. Her name was June Castille, and she was not what either man expected. She was young, 30s maybe, and she drove up the hollow in a mud-splashed county truck with a transit and a steel chain and a leather case of old plat books, and she went about her work with a quiet, exact patience that Silas, watching from his porch, recognized like a face from a dream. She measured twice. She wrote everything down. What the hollow did not know, what Odell Trask certainly did not bother to learn, was why June Castille had become a surveyor at all. Her grandfather had farmed ground over in the next county. Good ground, his whole life. And a neighbor had taken it from him a piece at a time, the slow way, the quiet way, until the old man had nothing left to leave but a lawsuit he couldn't afford and a bitterness that followed him into the grave. June had been a girl at his bedside at the end. The last thing her grandfather ever told her was that the line had been wrong, that he'd always known it was wrong, and that nobody had ever come out with a chain to prove it. She'd carried a chain ever since. She had spent her whole career reading fences against monuments, and she had learned the thing that men like Odell never believe until it's too late, that a fence is an opinion, and a monument is a fact, and that the ground remembers what people would rather it forgot. So when June Castille came down the hollow that spring, she was not a neutral instrument. She was a woman who had been waiting her entire life to catch a fence thief. She just didn't know yet that she'd found the best documented one in the history of the state. Odell met her at the line like a man greeting good news. He'd had 22 years to build his confidence, and it had grown as steadily as his tobacco. He shook June's hand, and he walked her along the fence, and he talked, the way he always talked, telling her how long that fence had stood, how his and Renfro's daddies had built it, how a line that old was a line the law respected. "You'll find it's all square, honey," he said, easy and warm. "That fence has been right there better than 20 years. That's the boundary, plain as day. Fella can't just come along after 20 years and start moving a line that's been settled that long. Why, that's the law. Adverse possession, they call it." He said the words like a man laying down a winning hand. "You hold ground that long, open and peaceable, it's yours. Ask any lawyer." Then, because he was a careful man in his own way, he reached into his coat and brought out a folded paper, soft at the creases from handling, and he showed it to her with the pride of a deed in his hand, because that is exactly what it was. "And it's all recorded, too," he said. "Right down at the county. Corrected survey, filed proper, years back. So there's your line, Miss Castille, on the fence and on the paper both. Won't be much for you to do out here but agree with it." June took the folded deed. She unfolded it. She read the metes and bounds, and she looked at the fence, and she looked at the deed again, and a small line appeared between her eyebrows that Odell was too pleased with himself to notice. For just a moment, and this is the moment the whole thing hung by, it looked like Odell Trask might be right. He had the fence, he had the years, and now he had a recorded government deed that said the line was exactly where he'd stolen it to. Against all that, what did the old man across the road have? a reputation as a coward and a burned-up house. The paper was going to win. Anyone standing there that morning would have bet on it. But June Castille did not agree with the fence, and she did not agree with the paper. She walked the line the rest of that day, and she did not measure from the wire. She measured from the ground. She got down on her knees at the lower corner of the bottom, and she brushed away the grass, and she found the top of an old iron pin, cold, solid, driven deep, set there in 1911 by a surveyor named Hollis, and never once moved by frost or flood or fire or a greedy man in the dark. She set her instrument over it. She checked it against the oldest plat book in her leather case, and then she stood up, and she looked at Odell Trask's fence, and the little line between her eyebrows had become something else entirely. The fence did not match the pin. The recorded deed did not match the pin. Both of them stood 30 feet and more to the west of where the monument said the line had been for 70 years. Somebody had moved a boundary in this bottom, moved it a long way, over a long time, and then filed a paper to make the theft look like the truth. June Castille had spent her whole life waiting to find exactly this. But a surveyor does not accuse, a surveyor establishes. And to establish it beyond any lawyer's argument, she needed one thing more than pins and old plats. She needed a record of when and how and by whose hand the fence had walked across that bottom. She turned from Odell, who was still smiling, and she looked across the road to where the quiet old man stood on his porch, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mr. Renfro," she called, "do you have any historical documentation of this line? Anything at all? Old letters, photographs, records? Anything that shows me where this fence used to be?" For a long moment the old man didn't move. Then Silas Renfro turned and walked into his house, and when he came back out he was carrying something wrapped in oilcloth, something scorched a little along one edge, something 22 years thick. He came down off the porch and across the road, and he put it in June Castille's hands. "Miss Castille," he said, "I have been waiting a long time for somebody to ask me that." June Castille sat on the tailgate of her county truck and opened the notebook, and the hollow went quiet around her. She did not read it the way you'd read a story. She read it the way a surveyor reads anything, with a pencil in her hand and her chain and her plat book laid out beside her, checking one against the other. And what she found in those pages stopped being interesting after about the third entry and started being something close to a miracle. Because Silas Renfro had not kept a diary. A diary is a man's feelings, and feelings don't hold up in this world. What Silas had kept was evidence. Every entry for 22 years was measured from the same fixed point. Not from the fence, never from the fence, but from the iron corner pin Hollis had set in 1911. The exact pin June had knelt over the day before. Every entry had a date. Every entry had the weather, so a man could check it against the county record if he wanted to. Every entry named what Odell had moved, and how far, and the reason Odell had given for it. Frost, flood, cattle, a truck. And beside every single line was a second mark and a second date in a different hand. The witness. Emmett Boone, who had held the other end of the tape by lantern light for 22 years. June looked up from the book, and she looked at the fence, and she looked back at the book. Then she said, half to herself, in the voice of somebody who has waited their whole life to see a thing and is almost afraid to believe it's real, "This man wrote down the whole theft, inch by inch, as it happened, for 22 years. Across the road, Silas Renfro said nothing. He'd been saying nothing for a very long time, but something in his face had changed, the look of a man who has carried a heavy thing alone for so long that he'd half forgotten it was ever meant to be set down. And Odell Trask, standing at his own fence with his smile going stiff at the corners, felt the ground move under him for the first time in 22 years. He did what men like Odell always do when the ground moves. He got loud. He'd called his lawyer out that morning, a slick fellow from the county seat named Pruitt, who'd driven up in a clean car to watch what everybody assumed would be an easy afternoon. And now Pruitt stepped up to the tailgate, and he looked at the notebook, And he laughed, the practiced laugh of a man who's paid to make other people's evidence disappear. "That's a diary," Pruitt said. "That's an old man's diary. Some numbers and some weather and a hired hand's initials. You can't hang a boundary on that, Miss Castille. Where's Emmett Boone? Let him come swear to it." "Emmett Boone's been dead 2 years," somebody in the small crowd said quietly. Pruitt spread his hands, pleased. "Well, there you are. A dead man's initials in a private book. That's not evidence, that's fiction. My client's got a recorded deed and a fence that stood 22 years. This is a scrapbook." And for a moment, a long, cold moment, it worked. You could feel it work. The crowd shifted. Even the county man frowned. Because Pruitt wasn't entirely wrong. A private book and a dead witness is a thin thing to set against a government deed. It looked, just then, like Odell Trask was going to walk away from 22 years of theft on the strength of a lawyer's laugh. June Castille let him finish. Then she reached into her leather case and took out 2 more things and laid them on the tailgate beside Silas's notebook. "He's not my only witness," she said. The first thing she laid down was another logbook, plainer, cheaper, filled in a rougher hand. "Emmett Boone kept his own," she said. "Mr. Renfro asked him to years ago, so there'd never be just one book to burn. Different pen, different hand, same dates, same measurements. 2 men, writing separately, agreeing to the inch, for 22 years. She tapped it. "That's not a diary anymore, Mr. Pruitt. That's corroboration." Pruitt's smile lost some teeth. Then June laid down the second thing, and it was the oldest and heaviest of them all, a plat book, cracked at the spine, the county's own copy of the field notes filed by the Surveyor Hollis in 1911. "And this," she said, "is the surveyor who set the pins, 73 years ago, before any man standing here was born." She opened it to a marked page and turned it so they could all see. Hollis's original measurements, and they match Mr. Renfro's starting line to the inch. Same corner, same bearing, same distance. She looked up, and she found Odell's eyes, and she held them. 3 separate records, Mr. Trask, made by 3 different men across 73 years, none of them able to talk to the others, and every one of them agrees on where this line belongs. The only thing in this whole bottom that disagrees is your fence and your paper." Pruitt tried one last card, because that's what he was paid for. "The recorded deed." "Let's talk about the deed," June said, and now her voice had gone flat and hard, the voice of the ground itself. She unfolded Odell's corrected deed and held it up. "This was filed at the county 15 years ago. 15. The monuments it contradicts were set in 1911. You cannot file a piece of paper in 1969 that overrules a corner pin from 1911. That's not how a boundary works, and every surveyor and every judge in this state knows it. The pin controls. It always controls." She let that sit. "But there's a worse problem than that, Mr. Trask." She looked at him the way her grandfather must have wished someone had looked at his neighbor, 50 years too late. "This deed didn't correct an error. There was no error. Hollis's survey was right, and Mr. Renfro's notebook proves you knew the true line the whole time, because you kept moving away from it a foot at a time, which means you didn't file a mistake. You filed a lie, at a government office, under oath, on purpose. That's not a boundary dispute anymore." She folded the paper closed. "That's fraud." The word landed in the quiet bottom like a dropped stone. And here is the thing that Odell Trask never understood, the thing that ruined him, the mistake he'd made 22 years ago on a fall morning by the spring, and repeated every single year since. If you've been paying attention, you already know what it was. June Castille said it out loud for the county man's benefit, and for the crowds, and for history. "Mr. Trask, your lawyer wants to say adverse possession. Hold the ground long enough and it's yours. And he's right that the law says that." She nodded slowly. "But the law has conditions on it, and they matter. To take a man's land by holding it, your possession has to be open. It has to be notorious. It has to be hostile, right out in the daylight where the true owner can see it and fight it. The whole idea is that if you're going to take a man's land, you have to do it where he can stop you. A theft you hide doesn't count. Secret possession earns nothing. It's not adverse possession at all. It's just trespass. She picked up Silas's notebook and held it up so the whole hollow could see the 22 years of small, hidden, midnight inches written inside it. And this is a record of a man doing everything he could to hide it. Frost, he said. Flood, he said. Cattle. A truck. Always at night. Always with an excuse. Always a little at a time so nobody'd fight him. You were so proud of how quiet you were, Mr. Trask. You thought the quiet was how you'd win. She closed the book. It's how you lost. Every inch you hid is an inch the law will never give you. Then she said the thing the whole hollow would repeat for a generation. The thing they'd say at the feed store and the church and over their own fence lines for years to come. Mr. Trask, if you had bragged about taking this land, stood up on your hay wagon and told the whole county you were doing it, you might have kept every foot. But you whispered. She looked at him without any pity at all. And the law does not reward a whisper. Odell Trask did not say anything. There was nothing to say. 22 years of patience, 22 years of clever quiet, 22 years of feeling like the smartest man in the hollow, and all of it had been building, brick by silent brick, a case against himself. Every excuse he'd ever given Silas was written down. Every inch he'd ever hidden was measured. Every quiet, careful, deniable thing he'd done in the dark had just been read out loud on the tailgate of a county truck, in front of the same men who'd laughed on his hay wagon. He looked, for the first time in 22 years, at Silas Renfro. And Silas Renfro looked back at him, and did not smile, and did not gloat, and said not one word, because he had never needed to. He'd told Odell the truth on the very first night, into an empty kitchen, over a single line of ink. I don't argue with a man who's already lying. I let the ground remember for me. The ground had remembered everything. Now there was only the counting up of what it would cost, and the giving back of what had been taken. 3 acres, a spring, and a walnut tree that Silas had not yet walked out to see. June Castille filed her survey with the state 3 weeks later, and it was not an accusation, and it was not an opinion. It was a fact, stamped and recorded, drawn from the monuments Hollis had set in 1911 and corroborated by 2 men's records across 22 years. It restored the Renfro-Trask line to exactly where it had always, truly, legally been. And the number at the bottom of it was 3 acres. 3 acres of the best bottom in the hollow, tobacco ground, the lower spring, and the strip that ran down to the walnut tree was ordered returned to Silas Renfro. Odell Trask was given until the end of the season to pull down 22 years of fence and take himself back across the true line, onto the ground that had actually been his all along, which turned out to be a good deal less ground than he'd been telling everyone he owned. That was the part that broke him. Not the losing of 3 acres, the finding out, in public, exactly how big he really was. Because a survey filed with the county is not a private thing. It is a public record, and in a small hollow, a public record is read the way the Bible is read, carefully and out loud, and by everyone. The men who had eaten Odell's barbecue and drunk his beer and laughed on his hay wagon while he toasted himself the biggest spread in the valley, those same men now drove down to the courthouse and paid their nickel and read, in the county's own stamped ink, what June Castille had established. That the biggest spread in the hollow had never been that big, that a good portion of it had been stolen, foot by foot, from the quiet old widower across the road. That the man they'd all called a coward for 22 years had been keeping a record the whole time, by lantern light, of every lie Odell Trask ever told them to their faces. The hollow is a small place. The story did not take a week, and the same laughter that had carried across the bottom on that fall night, the laughter Silas had sat on his dark porch and swallowed whole, went silent, and then turned, the way a crowd always turns, and went the other direction. Men who'd slapped Odell's back at the feed store now found somewhere else to look when he came in. The coronation was over. The story of the hollow had a new shape now, and Odell Trask was not the big man in it. He was the thief who'd been caught by a dead man's initials and an old fool's notebook. Remember that laughter I told you? Odell got to hear all of it come back around. But humiliation, a man can survive. Plenty do. What Odell Trask could not survive was arithmetic. Here is the thing nobody in the Hollow had known, the thing Odell had spent 22 years hiding even harder than he'd hidden the fence. He had never bought that farm with cash. There had been a note from the start, a big one, and over the years there had been more. Odell had borrowed against his land again and again to buy the trucks and the tractors, and to throw the parties and to be the big man. And the bank had lent it to him for one simple reason. They'd valued him by his acres. The more ground Odell appeared to own, the more the bank would lend against it. And a good part of the ground the bank had counted was the 3 acres he'd stolen. When June Castille's survey came back, the bank's collateral came back with it, smaller, by exactly the strip Odell had spent 22 years stealing to make himself look big enough to borrow against. The farm that secured his loans was suddenly, on paper, worth a good deal less than the loans themselves. The bank did what banks do. They called the note. Odell Trask had stolen 3 acres to make himself creditworthy, and the theft of those 3 acres was the very thing that now bankrupted him. He had built his own noose an inch at a time, and never once felt it tighten until the floor dropped. Every quiet, clever, greedy thing he'd done to get bigger was the exact machinery that now took everything he had. Within a year, the Trask place, all of it, the stolen part and the honest part alike, went to the bank, and then to auction, and then to strangers. Odell packed what a truck would hold, the way he'd come, and drove out of the Hollow. This time nobody came out to shake his hand. This time nobody talked at all. That is how greed unwinds, not with a lawyer's speech, with arithmetic and silence, and a man driving out of a place that will not miss him. Silas Renfro did not go to the auction. He did not go to the courthouse to read the survey either, though half the county did. He had already read the only record that mattered, in his own hand, over 22 years. On the first morning, the 3 acres were legally his again. Silas walked down into the bottom to see them. He walked the tobacco ground, and it was good ground. Better for the rest it had gotten under Odell's rose. He walked to the lower spring, and it ran clear and cold the way it always had. And then he walked the last stretch, the strip that ran down to where Ada's black walnut had stood for 30 years. The tree she'd planted the first spring they were married, no thicker than her wrist, for grandchildren they never had. The one thing of hers still living in the ground. The reason, if he was honest with himself, that some part of him had never been able to let the fight go. He came around the low rise, and he stopped. The tree was gone. Not fenced away this time. Gone. In its place was a stump, cut clean and low and gone gray at the edges, cut 2 winters back by the look of it, when it had stood safely on Odell's side of the stolen line and no one to say a word. Odell had taken it down for the lumber. Black walnut brings good money, and a man drowning in a note takes what he can sell. He'd cut Ada's tree and sawed it and sold it and spent it, likely without ever once knowing whose it had been or what it had meant. Silas Renfro stood over that stump for a long, long time. He had won. The survey said so. The county said so. 3 acres, the spring, the ground, all of it back, every foot, exactly as Hollis had drawn it in 1911. He had been right, and he had been patient, and he had beaten a greedy man with nothing but a lantern and a tape and 22 years of quiet. He had won everything he set out to win, and he had lost the one thing he could not measure. That is the truth about patience, and it is the truth this old man had earned the hard way. You can win back the land. You can win back your name. You can live long enough and stay quiet long enough to watch the ground itself testify against the man who wronged you. But some things a slow thief takes cannot be given back by any survey in the world. There is no monument that returns a walnut tree. There is no notebook that brings back the hand that planted it. Silas knelt down by the stump, the way his father had once knelt by the pin, and he put his palm flat on the cut wood. "Welcome home anyhow," he said, quiet, to the ground, to Ada. "Welcome home, anyhow." When the season ended and it came time for Odell to pull his fence, the last humiliation, hauling 22 years of stolen posts back across a line the whole county now knew he'd stolen, Silas did something the Hollow talked about nearly as much as the notebook itself. He didn't watch. He didn't gloat. He didn't stand on his porch to make sure the man felt it. He sent Emmett Boone's boy down with a wagon and a note that said Odell could take the good cedar posts with him if he wanted them, no sense leaving usable timber in the ground, and to let him do it with what dignity he had left. Some of the men at the feed store thought Silas was a fool for it, right to the end. A softer man would let his enemy crawl, they said. But Silas Renfro understood something they didn't, the same thing he'd understood on that first night by the spring 22 years before. He'd never done any of it to beat Odell Trask. He'd done it to keep the truth. And a man who's got the truth doesn't need to make another man crawl to prove it. The ground had already said everything that needed saying. The land was his again. His name was clean. And a new emptiness stood down in the bottom where his wife's tree used to be, a thing won back, and a thing lost for good, standing side by side, the way they so often do. He was an old man now, but he was not, it turned out, quite finished, because there was still one thing left to plant, and one person left to teach it to. Time did with Silas Renfro what it does with every man. It bent his back and slowed his walk and turned his hair the color of the frost he'd spent so many nights kneeling in. The 3 acres greened up and grew tobacco again, better than ever. The Hollow, in the way of small places, half forgot the whole thing and half turned it into legend, until men who hadn't been born when Odell Trask drove out of the valley could tell you all about the old man and his notebook. But Silas was not quite done. He had a grandson now, Ada's grandchild, the one she'd planted a tree for before there was anyone to plant it for. The boy's name was Wade, and he was 10 years old, which is about the age a boy is ready to be taught the only thing that ever really matters. So one cold spring morning, Silas took Wade out to walk the line. He walked him down through the bottom, past the tobacco, past the lower spring running clear and cold, all the way to the true corner. And there he got down on his old knees, slow, and he brushed the grass away from the top of an iron pin. "Now you listen to me," Silas said, and the words came up out of 50 years like water out of the ground. "This pin here was set by a man named Hollis before I was born. Your great-great-granddaddy walked me out here and showed it to me when I was younger than you, and told me what I'm about to tell you." He tapped the cold iron with one thick finger. "A fence can lie, Wade. A neighbor can lie. Your own eyes will lie to you if you let 'em. But this pin doesn't want anything. It's been telling the truth in the same spot for near 100 years, and it'll go right on telling it long after you and me are both gone. You lose everything else, you keep track of your pins." The boy looked at the little rusted rod in the ground, not understanding yet, the way Silas hadn't understood at his age. That was all right. Understanding would come. Silas had learned it the long, hard, expensive way, and he was hoping to save the boy the price of it. Then he reached into his coat and took out something wrapped in oilcloth, scorched a little along one edge, and he put it in the boy's hands. "And this," he said, "is what a man does when somebody won't respect the pin. He doesn't shout, he doesn't fight, he writes it down, every bit of it. He lets the ground remember for him." He closed the boy's small hands around the notebook. "It's yours now. There's nothing left to write in it, but you keep it, and you keep it dry, and someday you show it to yours." There was one more thing. Silas led the boy back up the strip to a low gray stump gone soft at the edges, and beside it, laid out ready, was a little black walnut sapling, no thicker than a boy's wrist, with its roots wrapped in wet burlap. "Your grandmother planted a tree right here, the first spring we were married," Silas said. "For grandchildren we didn't have yet." He handed Wade the shovel. "A man took it from us, cut it down and sold it, and there's no notebook in the world that brings a tree back." He looked at the stump a moment, and then at the boy, who was the grandchild the first tree had been planted for. "But a man can plant another one. Dig right there, by the old stump. Let 'em grow up together." So the boy dug, and the old man knelt beside him, and together they set Ada's second walnut into the same ground as her first. Silas pressed the earth down with his own hands. "Welcome home," he said. And this time there was no anyhow in it. This time he meant it clean. Now, before we leave these two in the bottom, let me tell you what this whole thing was really about. Because a story like this is worth more than the telling of it. Everything Silas Renfro did, the silence, the lantern, the tape, the notebook, 22 years of being called a coward by fools, every bit of it was one lesson. And it is a lesson you can carry off this hollow and use on your own ground, whatever your ground happens to be. When somebody starts taking from you a little at a time, a slow thief, the kind that counts on you being too polite or too tired or too decent to make a scene, do not confront him. Not first. Confronting a careful thief only teaches him to be more careful. Document him. Write it down, with dates, with witnesses, measured from something that cannot move. Because in the end, an argument is just two men's words against each other, and words wash out. But a record made at the time it happened, that is a thing the truth can stand on, in a courthouse or anywhere else. A fence is an opinion. A monument is a fact. And the things a man takes in secret, in the dark, where no one can see him do it, can never truly become his, not by the law, and not by anything deeper than the law either. Patience is not weakness. Sometimes patience is the loudest thing a man owns. He just has to be willing to wait long enough for the ground to speak for him. There was a rich and famous oil man, in a story you may know, who did it the other way. He took, and he took, and he shouted, and he schemed, and he beat down every man who stood between him and more. And he won. He won everything there was to win. And he ended his days alone in a great empty house with nothing but his money and his rage, having driven off every soul who ever cared for him, muttering that he was finished. Odell Trask was a smaller man with a smaller version of the same hunger, and it ended him the same way, with less than he started with, in a truck, driving out of a valley that would not miss him. But Silas Renfro chose the other road. He gave up 22 years of comfort and ease and his own good name in the meantime, and he did not gain the world. He gained back 3 acres of Kentucky bottom and his father's truth, and a clean name, and a boy who would carry all of it forward. And when you set those two men side by side, the one who took everything and the one who waited for what was his, it is not hard to see which of them was rich, and which of them only looked it for a while. The old man and the boy walked back up out of the bottom together in the last of the light. Behind them, a new tree stood in old ground. Below them, an iron pin held the truth it had held for 100 years. And on the boy's arm, wrapped in oilcloth, closed now for good, was the record of a quiet man who had let the ground remember for him, and won. Now I want to hear from you. If you had been Silas Renfro, could you have done it? Could you have stayed silent for 22 years, taken the whispers and the laughter, watched a thief eat your land a foot at a time, and just kept writing it down? Or would you have marched over there the very first week, said your piece, started the fight, and lost it all? Be honest. Tell me down in the comments. I read every one.